All right. Good morning, everyone. Welcome to Tuesday. Yeah, welcome to Tuesday. I don't think I have anything shocking or exciting to share with you. What's that?
I thought you said you have nothing to give us for today.
No, I've got tons of stuff. I've got like
And all about Egypt.
lectures and like I've got tons of material to show you and things for you to read and watch and yeah. I've got more than I can cram into this class. There's always more. Let's see who's here. Hadil is here. Good morning, Hadil. Michelle is here. Good morning, Michelle. And Mohammed is here. Good morning. Nope, sorry, Adon is here. Good morning, Adon. How are you? Okay, so that's going to be about it for Egypt. And so we've just kind of dipped our foot in the pool of Egypt, as it were. We learned a little bit about their history and culture, spent a little bit of time with religion because, of course, Egypt was a very religious society. We talked about the characteristics of religion, and we also talked a little bit about Mesopotamia and kind of the importance of story. And so in this sort of Northeast Africa, Middle East kind of area, we've learned a bit about story and a bit about religion, a little bit about kind of some of the first civilizations in that part of the world to start to develop and grow food and build buildings and create complex societies. And so what I wanted to do is just do a quick little review about Egypt, but also Mesopotamia as well, in terms of what have we learned kind of that we could put under these headings, okay? So if we were talking about connections between culture and the environment, what kind of things could we say about either the Egyptians or about the Mesopotamians?
They were relying a lot on the environment, from clay to water to crops to building their buildings,
Yeah.
their lives.
Yeah, so the natural environment and the resources that these people have plays a pretty significant role in how they wind up living their lives, right? They do have technology, but not like we have technology, right? And so they're really kind of building their world out of much more simple materials than we build our world out of, right? And so Baha mentioned clay or stone or wood or timber. Those things are critically important to how a society constructs its world, because again, the technology level is quite a bit lower thousands of years ago than it is now. And so the natural environment has a pretty significant effect on what people's lives are like, right? Here in sort of the modern world, much less so, right? Because you want a fancy word? The environment we live in is anthropogenic. So it is a man-made environment for the most part, right? We're not really living in nature here in Vancouver. We're living in a city that people have created, right? We've paved parts of it. We've planted trees in other parts. We've built buildings and we've climate controlled those buildings so the temperature is right where we like it to be. We kind of live in environments that are created by us. And so, if it rains or snows or is sunny outside, this class pretty much goes on as normal, right? The weather does not affect us in any way. But for people in the past, the weather, the physical environment, the resources they had available, that really had a big impact on how their life was lived, right? What else can we say about culture and environment?
Very related to religion.
They're related to religion? How so?
For example, the Sumerians or the Egyptians, they had an explanation for every natural thing here.
Right. So people didn't really know the scientific explanation for a lot of the natural phenomena that are around us. And so they often attributed those things to supernatural powers or supernatural beings, right? And so the most common version of this is that every force of nature has a god associated with it, and the god makes it happen, right? There's a god of the sky, and the god of the sky controls the sky and makes it clear or cloudy or stormy, right? And so, yeah, people kind of explained these sort of big forces of nature. They explained those in religious terms, right? As controlled by supernatural forces or controlled by a god. Yeah, what else? Other ways the environment kind of influenced culture, or culture influenced environment, because it goes both ways.
If there's a like a road for them to train, they can like the environment would be a river, and they can trade from the river, so that impacts their culture. Trading.
Sure, or maybe if I could make that a little more broad, in not only trading, but in terms of interactions with others, right? Yeah, the way that a culture interacts with others has to do with the physical environment, right? So the Mesopotamians always had to worry about being attacked by other city-states or taken over by another empire. But for the Egyptians, for a long time, they didn't have to worry about that because the deserts surrounding the Nile protected them, right? So, but it also gave them, the rivers also gave them a way to travel from one area to another and trade, right? So sort of patterns of interaction, patterns of contact had to do with the physical environment and how easy it was to get somewhere or how difficult it was to get somewhere. You could definitely say that.
Also, nature divided them, the south and the north Egypt. They're depending on the two rivers.
They were, I don't know that so much that it was nature that divided upper and lower. I'm not really sure why that.
I don't mean like it divided them like directly, but like the south and the north Egypt each lived beside the river, so like it created a gap between them.
Okay. Yeah, I don't know what to say about it. I'm not sure I entirely understand what you mean. But definitely there was an upper and lower half. They were both they both lived beside the river. And
Yeah, if there were like not two rivers, it would be, and only one, they would like stay all of them together at the same place.
well, there is only one river.
But don't they have like two ways to the south and
Yeah, so Lower Egypt is in the northern half, and Upper Egypt is in the southern half. And so, yeah, but it's one river that winds its way through the whole thing. You know what I mean? Or are we talking past each other, or?
I'll pass on this.
Okay, okay. If it comes to you in a more clear form, then we can come back to it for sure. Other interactions between culture and the environment. Sorry, Nicholas first.
Because farming became a big thing in their culture.
What did?
Farming.
Farming became, yeah, so farming became a big thing in the culture because,
Now, I was going to say that because farming became a big thing, they had for the Egyptians, they had to move the environment. They had to go to a country.
oh, right. Yeah, so the Egyptians were farmers, but a change in the climate forced them to stay closer to the river, right? So over time, that area began to get warmer and drier. Places where they used to farm, they couldn't farm it anymore, and everybody had to sort of stick close to the river, and that resulted in a lot of additional complexity, right? Social and political complexity. And so, yeah, climate change had something to do with where these people were moved or kind of pushed in the environment, and yeah, it resulted in some cultural developments. So even something as simple as an area getting warmer and drier can have pretty significant effects on culture. Mulder and then Baha.
Yeah, I was gonna say their environment affect their subsistence patterns. Like the Egyptians farm a lot, and the Sumerians used to herd animals.
Yeah. So the physical environment definitely defines what is possible, right? And so this area of the world was really good for farming, and people did farm there, right? There's other places in the world where you can't farm, and so we can see their subsistence strategy is connected to the land that they live in, right? There's some places where things are good and you can do them, right? And some places where you can't, right? Things don't grow. I feel like I'm not getting your point, Mulder. Am I not? I'm not getting it, am I? I am? I'm not? I am?
Yeah.
Okay.
Their environment defines their subsistence patterns.
Okay.
And that it's culture, right?
Yes.
So yeah, that's what I was trying to
Okay. I was kind of trying to paraphrase it, and as I was saying it, I was like, I don't think this is what you meant, but if you're okay with it, then okay. Baha, what did you want to add?
Okay, so also they use the environment and they created ways to save their bodies and their history.
Right?
So like
Oh.
without the pyramids, the rocks won't survive with all the writings in them.
Right. So the Egyptians, in one way, they were inspired by the environment because dead bodies naturally mummify in the desert, right? So when Egyptians kind of saw that that was happening, it was like, oh, look at this, right? And that kind of got worked into their religious traditions and their sort of funerary traditions, right? That idea of mummification. Of course, they took it further, but the original idea was kind of inspired by just what happens naturally, right? But also, they were able to use their physical resources to help preserve those bodies and to create tombs in which to house these people, right? So, yeah, both of those are important. That's a good one. What else? Other environmental things? If I could take the religion thing a step further in terms of being inspired by religion, of course, all of those Egyptian gods have animal heads, or many of them do, and those are all animals that live in the area, right? And some of them are, they are given they're given the responsibilities that they are as gods, kind of because of what they're like, right? And so a good example is Anubis, right? And Anubis has the head of the jackal, right? And he's the god of kind of mummification and embalming. And you know what a jackal is, right? Kind of like a wild dog kind of thing. And jackals were often found around cemeteries because sometimes if you don't bury the body deep enough, the jackals will dig them up and eat them. So, you could find jackals hanging around cemeteries, right? And they're out at night and they're howling and things like that. And so, yeah, they kind of have a little bit of a, they're connected with that world, right? With cemeteries and with the darkness and howling and things like that. And so, maybe it makes sense that they get connected to the underworld and mummification and death because that's kind of where you see them. You see them, skulking around cemeteries and things like that. Okay, what about politics and power and authority and governance? What do we learn about?
The pharaoh is their
Yeah, so in Egypt, Pharaoh is the god, right? He's not just the king, but he's more than that. He is divine, right? What else do we learn?
whoever he is a rule, whoever he gives is a punishment.
Right. So Pharaoh, being a god, doesn't have to rely on written law codes, right? He is the sole authority, right? Not only does his authority come from the heavens, but so does he, right? So whatever he says, that's the law, right? And although, we learned about some situations where pharaohs became more or less powerful, and sometimes priests or governors kind of pushed back against the pharaoh. And so there's little political things going on there too. But on paper, anyway, the pharaoh's word is law, right? What else do we learn? Authority and governance,
Hierarchy.
power.
Between the social status between each individual.
Sure, both of these societies are hierarchical, right? So there are status and power differences between people. When we started off thousands of years before with hunter-gatherers, you would see that there really isn't any social hierarchy at all. Most people are pretty much on the same level, and maybe you would have respected your elders a little more, as often we're taught to, but that kind of would have been it, right? But here we see society grows more complex, and people have pretty vast, pretty big differences in power and authority and opportunity, right? Contrast, two hunter-gatherers who are pretty much equal, and contrast a slave and the pharaoh, right? Wildly different levels of power and authority and privilege, if you want to use a social justice term, right? Big differences in experience between these two groups. And yeah, we see that both Mesopotamian society and Egyptian society have these social hierarchies, and they're kind of pretty similar, right? With some sort of king or ruler at the top, some sort of government officials, sometimes priests up there too, and then bureaucrats, people working in the government, and then merchants and craftspeople and farmers, and then finally slaves, right? So even though these societies are different, their social hierarchy kind of shakes out in a very similar kind of way, right? What else do we learn? Power, governance.
The pharaoh must marry a woman from the family, cannot go outside.
Yeah, often we see that the pharaoh is marrying a close relative, right? Because every time you marry someone outside of your family, that means that other family might have a claim to the throne, right? They might want to try and put one of their relatives, on the throne, and then that person can look after their family. And so the more families that are connected to the royal family, the more political intrigue there is in terms of who is going to be able to, it's the Game of Thrones, right, is basically what it is. But so the Egyptians try to minimize that risk by marrying within one family so that no one else has a claim to the throne. But of course, as we mentioned, that's kind of gross, and it has other negative effects as well. What else? Governance, power, authority. Hammurabi, what did we learn about Hammurabi? Right. So rulers can legitimize their power and their rules by connecting themselves with the gods, right? And so Hammurabi has that in his law code at the top. He has a little carving of him, and he's receiving justice from the god of justice, or whoever it is. But he's receiving that from the gods. And so, when Hammurabi says, "You're not allowed to do this," it's not really just Hammurabi saying it, it's the gods are saying it, right? And so that gives those laws a lot more force, right? It gives them a lot more power. What else? Anything else?
Also, pharaohs are the only one who are mummified.
Right. Initially, pharaohs were the only ones who were mummified, but then I forget if it was in a video or the book, but they said that mummification was kind of democratized, right? So more and more people started saving their money and trying to get themselves mummified as well. Probably not in such a fancy way as the pharaoh, but they paid for what they could afford. What about interactions and exchanges, cultural interactions? Yeah, for both of these civilizations, the waterway was an important means of transport, right? Of moving things within the civilization, but also trading things outside, right? What else did we learn? This is good. I think we learned that, or maybe I should just restate, that these civilizations, Egypt and Mesopotamia, they were in contact with each other. They were trading with each other. They knew each other existed. And Mesopotamia was also in a trade network with the Indus River Valley civilizations, which we'll talk about very shortly, that are kind of in modern day India, Pakistan. And so thousands of miles away, these early civilizations were in contact with each other, and they traded with each other, and they knew each other existed.
But didn't they say at the beginning of the women, there were like only two people, then they started getting married, and the women started getting married, and the rest of the world came?
Oh, yeah, we can talk about that with religion, though. But that's kind of a religious story, right? So, I guess we can talk about that here. The idea is that we didn't talk about it a lot, but all religions, all cultures have some sort of creation story, right? A story that answers where did the world come from, and how is it that we are all here, right? And so science tells us a story that there was a big bang, and then eventually all this matter collected into planets that started orbiting suns, and then on this one, life began to evolve, and after a few billion years, you have Justin Bieber, right? So that's the science story, right? And then there's some religious stories that say, oh, God created the heavens and the earth, and then all of the animals and the lightness and the dark. And then he created humans and put them on this planet, right? And there's lots of other creation stories that explain that as well. And so we kind of had a brief mention of the Sumerian creation story and the Egyptian creation story, both of which are kind of strange and bizarre, which many creation stories are. But yeah, every culture will have some way to describe that, right? How is it that the earth is here, and why are we here? How did that happen? And so every culture will explain it just a little bit differently. Not much about conflicts and conflict resolution. Is there anything we can say about that, really?
Like maybe between them when they started burying the mummified people, or not stealing their precious things they put in.
Okay, that's a good one. So the idea is that people were buried, particularly pharaohs were buried with lots of treasure, and they were sealed up in tombs to make sure that nobody robbed them. To rob the tomb would be a sacrilegious act, right? You would be violating the tomb of a god, right? And you would be taking the belongings of a god. That seems like pretty serious stuff, right? But the lure of money was too much for some people anyway, right? So even though this was a profoundly religious society, it seems like maybe there was people who were not quite as religious as others, or they were willing to risk it to get the cash, right? Yeah, that could be part of it. That's good. What else? Conflicts. Did we hear about any conflicts? I guess in Mesopotamia we did, right? Because there were a series of empires, and those empires were won by military conquest, right? And so the Akkadian Empire, and then the what's that? The Neo-Babylonians, and then the Assyrians, and then the Persians later on. All these empires are kind of appearing in Mesopotamia, and they're pretty much all created through military conquest, right? They're not created through diplomatic negotiations, right? Unless it's negotiations with a sword. So those are all won through military campaign, through military violence. And the Egyptians do the same thing, right? Those Middle Kingdom and New Kingdom pharaohs are interested in taking over more land, right? And they do. They take over sort of larger chunks of what's now Israel or Jordan or Lebanon, or maybe even up into Syria. I think some Egyptian pharaohs managed to take a piece of what might be modern Syria as well. Values and beliefs. Yeah, we learned lots about religion. What? Say it one more time. Oh, yeah. Both of these civilizations are polytheistic, right? So these are civilizations that have many. Well, all you really need is more than one, but multiple gods, right? So there's all kinds of gods that control different things. What else did we learn? Values and beliefs. Right? So people believed in the divinity of the pharaoh, and therefore his rule is law. What's that? Divinity, the fact that he is divine, he is a god. Yes. What else? Values and beliefs. What do people believe in or value?
So they said the slave can be free.
Okay, so I guess slavery is a thing, right? People do keep slaves in both of these societies, but I think in both societies they can also be freed as well, right? Probably not all the time, but sometimes it happens. All right, we hear a little bit about what the rights of women were, right? And the textbook kind of makes a point of saying that the rights and freedoms that Egyptian women had were actually pretty good for the time period, right? There was lots of civilizations where women had less freedom and less autonomy, and here in Egypt it actually was pretty good by ancient standards anyway.
Life after death?
Oh yeah, ideas of life after death. And what did we learn about that?
Whenever king or some god dies, we bury and mummify them.
Yeah, we heard a little bit about the treatment of the dead, right? Particularly the pharaoh, and how the body must be treated and preserved and put into a tomb. And there's timing, right? There's a 40-day cycle, and then at the end of the 40 days, they have to be buried before the sun sets. And there's all these kind of rules and rituals around burying someone or burying pharaoh. So what else did we learn? What about those five elements of religion? Do you remember what they were? The characteristics of religion, the more general ones? Right? The belief in some sort of supernatural force.
Every religion should have a holy person, like someone who can talk to God or something.
Right? So every religion has some sort of supernatural force or being, and they have people that can sort of interact with those supernatural beings. What else?
Reduce anxiety by providing explanations.
Right? Religions reduce people's anxiety by answering the big unanswerable questions. Well, I guess they're not unanswerable if people do answer them, but you know what I mean. What else?
Establishing social norms.
Right. Religion helps establish social norms. They help people to cooperate well by giving them standards of behavior, right? What else?
Religion is social controlling society.
Right. Religion acts as a form of social control, right? There are things that you can do and things that you cannot do. And if you break the rules, punishment will follow, right? And usually big punishment, right? There was one more.
Transfer the decision making.
Right. So religion either transfers the responsibility of decision making to the gods, or maybe in the other way, it legitimizes your power, right? I am your king because the gods have chosen me, right? And maybe it's because I'm victorious in battle. Maybe I was able to draw the sword from the stone. Maybe, because I can reach out and the hammer returns to me. Whatever it is, the gods have determined that I am your king, right? So that works both ways. I get to blame the gods for what goes wrong, but I can also use them to, lend me support. Can I list them again? They are in the slides. They are in the slides, but it was the supernatural forces and people who can interact with them, answering the unanswerable questions, form of social control, legitimizes rulers. I guess we could just summarize that one that way, and social norms, right?
Yeah, there's one more. That's
Oh.
rational, like it is rationalized by the sentiments.
Oh, right. And the fact that religious beliefs are rationalized or legitimized through mythical stories, right? The mythical stories help to prove, they don't really prove, not in a scientific way, but they help to prove that the religious stories are true, right? So that's an important piece as well. So myth as support for religion. Cultural expressions, what did we see? How did people express themselves through art or architecture or language or
Either gods or states.
what's that?
Either gods or states.
How do you mean?
Like all the pictures we have, God punishing or, as we said, with the feather of truth.
Okay, well, maybe I can. So we did see in some like paintings and inscriptions on tomb walls and things like that, we see some of these characters we hear about, right? Either religious characters like the gods, we see real life people like the pharaoh or his wife, and we see kind of abstract concepts, right? The feather of truth is mat, right? It's the universal balance. And so we see all of those things represented for us on tomb walls, right? That's important. What else do we see?
Egyptian is stylized or inconsistent.
Right, we see the Egyptians have kind of an art style or a way of kind of painting and showing things, and that style is very stylized and very consistent, right? It almost never changes for thousands of years, right? And again, we said that's pretty remarkable. If you study art history, you'll see that European art has been evolving for hundreds of years, and there's all these different artists and periods and ways of doing things and so on and so forth. But Egyptian art stays really consistent for a long, long time. What else?
The writing style.
Yeah, we learned a little bit about the writing style of both cultures, right? The cuneiform writing of the Mesopotamians and the Egyptians, who show off and have three different ways of writing. What else?
The sculptures of Ephod.
Right, we see lots of sculptures and statues of gods and of kings. Those are pretty cool.
The like hieroglyphics are used for rituals, and so the culture is expressed through the use of this particular script.
Yeah, so I guess the idea that people are expressing themselves through script and all through writing, but also that the style of writing has different purposes, right? And so that hieroglyphic form is much, is the formal, the religiously significant language, right? And that happens in other religions and other cultures as well. I know that in for the Christian church and for the Catholic church, Latin was the language of the church for a long, long time. So Latin, of course, comes from the Roman Empire that made Christianity its official religion, but priests were still saying Mass in Latin up until very, very recently, to the point where like most people didn't even understand Latin anymore, but the priests were saying things in Latin. My mom actually had to take Latin in school when she was younger, which is weird because nobody speaks Latin anymore, but she still had to do it, right? So you can see, the Egyptians had this very formal way of writing that was attached to religion, and in Western culture, Latin is kind of like that for Christianity because Christianity kind of grew and spread through the Roman Empire and then the Byzantine Empire, and Latin was kind of the official language of that empire, and so it became the official language of Christianity as well. And there's still little bits of Latin sprinkled throughout Christianity and Christian masses as well. But anyway, comparison. What else? Anything else?
The drawings on the tomb in the grave.
Yeah. Oh, okay. So the fact that the Egyptians kind of expressed themselves on the walls of these tombs, right? And I forgot to say it, but when we were watching the videos, that a lot of those paintings are thousands of years old and they're quite faded and degraded. But try to imagine like every square inch of those walls would have been painted, right? Like there would have been color everywhere, right? And so what we're seeing is kind of a very sort of washed out, faded kind of version, but the colors all would have been really bright and bold and everything would have been colorful. But yeah, they express themselves that way for sure. And it's interesting to think about what's not there too, right? So things like music they would have played, dances they would have done, all of those things would have existed as well, but of course they don't really preserve in any kind of way, right? So it would have been interesting to hear, if there was a big festival in ancient Egypt, it would have been interesting to see, what kind of songs they were playing or what kind of dances they were doing to those songs, or, they definitely exist, but we just don't know what they were. We don't know what they were like, really. Anything else we should say about those two civilizations before we let them go? Besides that they're super cool and interesting, at least to me. Okay, so we'll leave that for now and we'll move on to another civilization. This civilization is one that I'll admit, when I started teaching this course, I did know a lot about Mesopotamia and Egypt because I was interested in them. But I didn't know a lot about this next civilization. And so it took me a couple of years to kind of build kind of a unit on it and put it into this course finally. But I'm so glad I did because it's such an interesting area of the world. And it's an area of the world that I didn't really have a ton of knowledge about prior. So I'm really glad we get to do this next one because this next one, this is some of the things. This next one is about India. And India is similar to Mesopotamia and Egypt. Civilization in India goes back probably at least 7,000 or 8,000 years as well. And I think recent archaeological evidence has shown that India actually might be the site of the world's first civilizations. And so originally Mesopotamia was supposed to be the first one, but now it seems like these Indian civilizations in the Indus River Valley are actually the oldest. And so that's really interesting. And so we'll spend some time talking about India and sort of the development of kind of early Indian civilization and how how things kind of develop. It's really interesting. But before we do that, maybe it's a good time to take a break here, stretch our legs, and then we'll come back and start talking about India, okay? All right. Okay, and we're back. So leaving Egypt behind and now heading east or west, if you want to go the long way, you will eventually hit India, right? And we said that India was another kind of one of the world's first complex civilizations. It didn't receive quite as much attention as Mesopotamia and Egypt did, partly because Egypt and Mesopotamia were more strongly connected to the Western world, and so the Western world paid more attention to them and paid less attention to Indian civilizations. But they're really intriguing and interesting. We'll see some of the same things occur. We'll also see some different things occur. Yeah, let's get into this. This is interesting. So, India. We're going to try and pay attention to some of the same things that we did with Egypt. These are some categories here that we were just discussing and kind of reviewing. So we'll try to pay attention to those as we move through this section. Here, of course, is the Indian subcontinent before India as a country. India only becomes a country, I believe, in 1949. And so it's a fairly young country, but it's a fairly old part of the world in terms of culture history and sort of complex cultural history. The first kind of evidence of course, humans had been living in India for thousands and thousands of years prior, but the first kind of civilizations that we see appearing happen here in kind of what's now Western India and Pakistan. And so there's a complex series of rivers in what's called the Indus River Valley. And around those rivers, just like in Mesopotamia and just like around the Nile, are you with me, Ayman? You with me? Okay. Noah, are you with me? Are you sure? Okay. Adil, you with me? Okay. So there's these civilizations that kind of appear by the river valley, just the same as we saw with Sumer and Akkad and the Egyptian cities. They all appear beside the river really for the very same reason, right? Is that their populations are increasing. They need to intensively farm or practice intensive agriculture. And so because of that, they need a water source, right? They need to supply their crops with water, and of course they need to drink as well, right? And so again, people settle by the river for exactly the same reason. And here it's in the Indus River Valley. There's a couple of kind of bigger cities that appear. Probably the most popular ones are Harappa there to the north, and a little bit further south is Mohenjo-Daro. And so these are the kind of two big cities that kind of appear, or city-states that appear, probably around, again, about 5,000 or maybe a little bit earlier, 5,000 years ago. So kind of on a similar timeline to the Egyptians and the Mesopotamians. You can see there's tons of actual little towns and cities around this part of the world, starting around, maybe 5,000 years ago and going to around 4,000 years ago. Lots of little towns, and again, a handful of bigger city-states as well. Harappa and Mohenjo-Daro are the main ones. Right, so lots of information here, but again, this kind of summarizes the idea that people had been living in this part of the world for thousands of years prior, but around maybe 5,000 years ago or so, we see complex urban centers appearing, complex cities, people starting to practice intensive agriculture. We see writing systems. We see all of these things that we saw in Mesopotamia starting to appear here as well. We see them developing evidence of technology like bronze tools. Bronze, if you'll remember, is an alloy of copper and tin. So it's much stronger than copper. Copper is a pretty soft metal, actually. And so adding a little bit of tin to it really makes it quite a bit stronger and more durable and more useful. They developed their own writing system, and as I'll explain to you in a second, unfortunately, we haven't been able to learn how to read this writing system. And so this is a civilization. This is another reason why we won't spend a ton of time on it, because we don't really know quite so much about them because we can't read their writing. So we only know them through archaeological evidence, but the writing system is a mystery. And so we don't really know what they were writing down or what they were thinking or believing. The cities are actually quite complex, and so I'll show you some pictures and some floor plans of them later. And they actually have basically the world's first sewage system. So believe it or not, these cities had a way to channel wastewater out of the city automatically, which super advanced for the time. You basically won't see this again. After like Mohenjo-daro and Harappa, you will not see sewage systems appear in a city for thousands of years after. So they were really ahead of their time in terms of sewage. Baha.
Oh, so you were talking about old Indian or recent Indian language?
No, this is the old one. So the writing system from Harappa and Mohenjo-daro is totally different from later Sanskrit. Sanskrit is the kind of language that kind of modern Hindi is sort of descended from. But this is actually goes back before Sanskrit, before Hindi, and it's a totally different thing. So we have no idea what these people were speaking. We don't know what it sounded like, and we don't know how to read any of it either. So it's a bit of a mystery, their language, unfortunately.
Do we have any evidence of that?
Evidence of?
The language?
Sure, I'll show you some in just a second. Yeah, I'll get to it in just a second there, Baha. So this area of the world, again, we saw the creation of large monumental cities, just like we saw in the Middle East. We have lots of archaeological evidence of sort of standardized weights and measures and fancy pottery. Lots of things made with brick, which I'll show you in just a few minutes. And one of the things that we've kind of been able to infer is that there was some sort of kind of centralized political and economic control, because people were doing things in very similar ways throughout this region. So they were planning their cities similarly, they were building things similarly, and so it suggests that someone was actually in control, like there was some sort of centralized political government or king or something that was saying, this is the way things are done, this is the way I want cities built, everyone do it this way, right? So this sort of standardization suggests that somebody was actually in control of the whole area. Yeah, so here's kind of what's left of one of these cities. I think this is Mohenjo-daro, but don't quote me on that. And so you can see here that, fairly large city, lots of building made of bricks, right? But you can see that there's not much left. There's just the bottom, 2 or 3 feet of walls. The rest is sadly kind of gone, right? Either eroded away or more likely probably borrowed, and people in the past probably took the bricks and used them for other things. And so the city has kind of been stripped of, certainly anything valuable or useful, but even the walls themselves have been torn down to make other things, right? Here's another. This one is, this is actually, looks like a pool. And so archaeologists think this might have been some kind of pool. And whether it was for, ritual functions, or maybe it was just, a fun place to take the kids, we have no idea because we can't read anything. All we know is it's this large kind of basin that seems to have been a pool, was probably filled with water, and served some purpose. But we don't know what the purpose was. This is what stinks about not being able to read the writing, is you find things like this and you have no idea what they're for. Some scholars have pointed out that in later Indian religious tradition, the importance of bathing, so like of washing yourself in the water to purify yourself, is part of later Indian religious tradition. And so some people have said, oh, well, maybe that is reflected here as well. Maybe people were purifying themselves in this pool before they went to a temple to worship whatever god. But again, we don't know this stuff. Yeah, so lots of consistency in terms of the construction of buildings and roads and sewage systems. And again, a script, some sort of writing system for their language that, again, we don't really understand. It seems like it was like ancient Egyptian in that some symbols represented entire words or concepts, and some symbols represented sounds, right? And so, again, we see this kind of consistent language, but we don't know what it means. And so here's one of the things that we find from the Indus River Valley civilization. And actually there's tons of these, and they seem to be seals, okay? And so a seal as in they're like a signature or a trademark, right? And so you might have this and it might be made of clay or it might be made of stone, and maybe this is your family name, right? And so maybe my family is, the bull is a symbol of my family and it's got my name at the top. And maybe, I make clay pots. And every time I make a clay pot, I stamp this in the bottom of it to say that I made it. It was my family made this, right? Or maybe if I sign a business deal, right, instead of signing my name, maybe I impress this in the clay and that's my official signature. And so you see these kind of these seals, or sometimes they're in a cylinder. I'll try and show you one in a second, that serve as an official signature, right? You sort of saying, this is me, I agree to this, or whatever. And so you can see here, again, there's a bull, but there's also some characters at the top, right? And again, it would be great to know what those say. We assume it's maybe a name, but we don't know. We have no idea what this says. Yeah, here's another one. And I think this one is in the form of a cylinder. So again, you can see a bull. There's a couple of similar characters here, right? You can see the wheel. The wheel shows up in both. And then this one looks like a toilet brush. Whoops. That one looks like a toilet brush. And there's a toilet brush in that one too. So there's a few kind of similar characters, right? But again, without really knowing what they mean, it's hard to know. That one might be a wheel, but I'm pretty sure the other one isn't a toilet brush. So I don't know. We don't really know what's going on here. But this one is actually in a cylinder, right? And so if you wanted to sign your name in clay, you would put it on the piece of clay and then you would just roll it on the clay and it would make an impression like this. So you'd have the bull and sort of maybe your name on the top or something. Again, it's not clear what this is. Yeah, and here's another one, and we're not sure if this one is a seal or what's going on here. This one's pretty interesting though, right? What do you think about this one? What's that? It's broken. Yeah, we're missing a portion of it, which is too bad. But what do you see? Right? What kind of animals? Yeah, there's an elephant, it looks like. Did you say a rhino? Yeah, it looks like there's a rhino right there. Maybe a cow. I kind of see. Yeah, there's a guy sitting kind of in the yoga position, right? Or the cross-legged kind of meditative position, which is interesting because this is thousands of years before yoga, as far as we know, and thousands of years before Hinduism and Indian gurus and all of those kind of people who are meditating. This is way before that. But here we see some kind of character kind of sitting there in a yoga or meditative kind of pose, right? What's he got on his head, do you think? Yeah, maybe a crown or horns. Kind of hard to tell, right?
What's the animal next to him?
If that's a priest, can't have horns on the head.
There's what?
If he's a priest,
If
Because they used to worship the cows.
oh,
So they can't have horns.
right. But that's kind of interesting, right? Because in sort of modern Indian thought, cows are
God.
cows are sacred. Cows are a god. But here we have someone wearing the cow horns, and so does that make him a god? Not now, but maybe thousands of years ago. Possible, right? Oh, he's got a tiger beside him too. That's kind of cool. There's a tiger beside him. There's a few. It looks like there's men around him. Yeah.
The bottom of
I'm not sure what's at the bottom. That looks like an apple core to me, but I don't know.
yeah, over to the right. Is
The-
that somebody dancing?
Maybe. Could be. It's kind of hard to know what's going on here, right? And again, because you can't read anything, it's anybody's guess, right? This could be the seal of a family. This could be a depiction of a god, right? Maybe it's a cow god or something like that, a god of the harvest. He could be a spiritual leader or a king. Hard to know, right? Something's going on here, right? This is a very distinctive character. And it's very interesting that he has the cow horns and he's in this sort of, very stereotypical sort of yoga pose or something. But yeah, we don't really know what's going on, right? Which is frustrating because it could be all kinds of things, but we just don't know what's happening with this guy. Again, so we have sort of archaeological evidence that suggests that this part of the world was under some sort of centralized control. So somebody was in charge, whether it was kings or a king or whoever. Somebody was in charge of this area and was kind of telling people how to do things. And so people were doing things in a similar way, right? There's consistency in agriculture and building and writing and measurements, and all these kinds of things are standardized. So it suggests that some single force was in control, right? Yeah, we've got these two main cities, and here, here's a plan of Harappa. And so archaeologists have kind of mapped the walls and the streets of Harappa, and you can see it's kind of built with kind of one main road, right? There's kind of one main open road through the town, and then there's lots of little buildings that are kind of squished together and attached to it. And Mohenjo-daro looks kind of similar. Whoops, there's an aerial view of what you can see. Mohenjo-daro is kind of the same thing, right? With one central street and then kind of a smaller street out on the right. Kind of the mirror image of Harappa, which is one big avenue and then a smaller street out to the left. But again, these cities are kind of laid out in a very similar pattern, suggesting that somebody's telling people how to lay out the cities. Right, we saw that already. Here's maybe an artist's rendition of maybe what the city would have looked like. And the artist is trying to show us some of these brick buildings, but also the sewage system, right? And so if you went to Mohenjo-daro or Harappa, maybe not that picture. Oh, I thought I had one. Oh yeah, but this one, you would see that some of the streets had sewers. And so they built in these kind of drainage systems, and then you could put bigger stones over top, right? And so the water would be flowing basically below the sidewalk under your feet and out of the town, right? So for the time, I know this isn't a modern sewage system, but for the time, super advanced, right? You won't find plumbing like this until you get to Rome in another 3,000 years. So way ahead of the curve.
So it was not covered?
What's that?
It was not covered?
I think it probably was. I think you would you would lay these out and then you would put stones over top, bigger stones, and that would allow you to sort of walk down this sidewalk. It would be nice and flat, but underneath, water could flow. I think. Yeah, so a few artist renditions here. That's a picture, obviously, but of what a house in Harappa or Mohenjo-daro might have looked like, right? And so you can see there's kind of a main floor here, people maybe cooking or preparing food or tending to their babies, kind of a central open courtyard, right? So the city was built, or the houses were built in kind of a square with an open center so they could get some fresh air and maybe some sunlight in there. You can see people making a basket there on the second floor. It's got kind of a rooftop patio, which is a pretty fancy feature for thousands of years ago. You can see some guy on the toilet right there in the bottom right, because again, if you have a sewage system, you set it up so people can go to the bathroom and all that stuff gets carried away, right? So pretty advanced stuff for 5,000 or 6,000 years ago. Yeah, so I talked about this, the drainage system, very advanced, very kind of forward thinking, and again, something that most cities will not have, right? Ancient cities do not have this again until probably Rome. Again, in terms of their economy, we don't know a whole lot. We do know that they were growing crops, some wheat, some barley, some rice, peas and lentils and things like that are being grown. And they're also raising animals as well. So we have evidence of domestic cows and sheep and goats. Birds like chickens and stuff are being raised and eaten. And people seem to be using larger animals to help them do their work as well. So cattle or oxen or water buffalo are being used. And people have figured out how to train elephants as well. So these people are using elephants to help them do their work. We have evidence that people are weaving cloth, that people are making metal, pottery, all kinds of these things have developed. And again, we also have evidence of trade between the Indus River and Mesopotamia. So those cylinder seals that I just showed you, that you would roll onto the clay, some of those have actually been found in Mesopotamia, in sort of Sumer or Uruk or cities like that. So these people were actually moving between these civilizations. People from the Indus River Valley traveled to Mesopotamia to trade or to work. And likewise, people from Mesopotamia may have gone to the Indus River cities as well. So pretty interesting, right? Globalization starts a long time ago. Yeah, so we've got trade in metals, we've got trade in semi-precious stones. Yeah, very interesting. Now, religion is something that we were able to talk about in a lot of detail with the ancient Egyptians. Here, again, unfortunately, it's really hard to know, right? So we have that big sort of pool-like structure at Mohenjo-daro. Was it a ritual purification bath, or was it just a pool? Hard to know, right? It's very tempting to assume it had religious significance, and in all honesty, it probably did, but we really just don't know. Again, we might try and infer things from these cylinder seals. A couple of them have bulls on them, so maybe the bull was seen, or the cow was seen as a particularly important animal in some way or another. Again, we have this sort of yoga meditating guy who maybe he's a god or a priest or a king, or maybe he's a mythical hero just like Gilgamesh was. Hard to know, right? He could be anybody. Yeah, so it's unfortunate that we aren't able to kind of figure these things out. This is a pretty popular archaeological find here from Harappa, I think. And he's called the Priest King. That's what he's called. We don't know if he was either of those things. He's a sculpture of a man from the period. We can see he has a beard and maybe a turban or some sort of head covering on and some sort of fancy robe. It's hard to say anything more about him otherwise. We don't know if he was a god or a king or just a handsome man who somebody carved. We're not really sure we're not really sure about this either. Again, he's called the priest king, but we don't really know if he was either of those things. And so this civilization is kind of the first to appear in this part of the world. It's around for about 1,000 years or so, but then it kind of declines and disappears. And so, again, we have this period of sort of complexity and building and centralized control and economic cooperation and intensive farming, but then it all kind of disappears, right? And again, we're not entirely sure what was happening there either, because if the people were writing about what was going on, we can't read it, right? We know that people from the west from the northwest started to move into this area around 1800 BC that we'll call the Aryans. This is a little different from, Hitler used this term, the Aryan race, but he kind of borrowed that term and applied it to the Germans, and it doesn't really have anything to do with the Germans. So here we're talking about a different thing. The Aryans are a group that come from kind of to the northwest of where the Indus River civilization is. And so they're probably from kind of from the east part of Central Asia, if you will. And so these people are not farmers, they're kind of nomadic, they're horseback riders, and they sort of start moving in around 1800, and they may have chased these people out of the cities. There's other ideas that maybe, again, climate change is involved, the course of rivers started to shift, maybe the Indus River Valley rivers didn't flood the same way as they used to, and maybe it's a combination of those factors. Maybe populations grew so big that the landscape couldn't support these people. Maybe it's all of these things at the same time. We don't really know. But either way, people start to leave those cities like Mohenjo-daro and Harappa, and that civilization, that culture, whatever it was and whatever it was like, seems to have been absorbed into the Aryan culture, or it seems to have disappeared. Okay, and so yeah, it's kind of it's a culture that flourishes for about 1,000 years. It seems to be complex and centralized, and all kinds of things are happening. And then it kind of vanishes from the record, right? And so, again, people may have moved. They may have been absorbed into this Aryan group that comes later. We're not really sure.
Another group that is wiped out by Aryans.
Yeah, but again, not the Aryans that you're thinking of. So they're not necessarily white, they're not European, they're not supremacist in any way. It's a different, again, the myth of the Aryan race is kind of something that develops later, and then it gets borrowed by Hitler, so it doesn't have anything to do with this. So, if you know anything about World War II and Hitler and his racial purification and Aryan race stuff, that's all a different thing. So these people are, a culture that, their horses are very important to them. They're from the open steppe area of Asia. They ride horses all the time, and that's how they kind of make their living. And so they move into this area and, sort of push these guys out. But it has nothing to do with anything you know about Aryans before. It's just the term was borrowed. Right. And so that brings us to this. And so I'd like you to read a little bit of the textbook that actually talks about who these Aryan people are, who they are, where they come from, a little bit about their religion, because unlike the Indus River Valley civilizations, we can actually read some of the Aryan script, or at least their stories have been passed down to the point where we can actually read them. So we do know something about these Aryan people in a little more detail than we knew about the Indus River people. So I'll give you some time to read this, and we'll learn about these kind of Indo-Aryans and see what they're about, okay? So textbook is in Microsoft Teams. I'll let you read, and then we'll chat, okay?